Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Kandi Wiens. I'll tell you all about Kandi in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership position, as you will discover that Dr. Wiens is, you do it with a common cause of bringing people together to improve things. So welcome, Dr. Kandi Wiens.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on.
I would like to tell everyone about you. You are the director of the University of Pennsylvania's Master's in Medical Education program. Mm-hmm. And you teach physicians and healthcare professionals how to teach better. What a great thing. Your work has been featured in Harvard Business Review and other books. Your new book is Burnout Immunity: How Emotional Intelligence Can Help You Build Your Resilience and Heal Your Relationship with Work. If ever there were a timely topic for today, that's it. So welcome, Dr. Wiens.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Burnout is a top-of-mind problem. Sadly, I wish it weren't, but fortunately, we have your book. So your new book explores ways we can deal with it. But first of all, how do we know we are suffering from burnout? Because sometimes we may not even realize it. Am I correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, the crazy thing about burnout, as I've had a number of my research participants tell me, and I've experienced this firsthand, is that for many of us, burnout is insidious, meaning that it sneaks up on us when we least expect it. It's not caused typically by people who experience acute stress, right? Stress in the moment. It's more the long-term chronic stress that builds up. Most of us have heard the boiling frog metaphor. Well, when that gets to the point where it's so overwhelming and we're losing sight of perhaps our values or what's most important to us, and we start sacrificing personal things for our professional gain, burnout can really sneak up on us. But to really identify whether or not we have it is, there are three main symptoms or common signs that people experience when they're burned out. The first one is emotional exhaustion. So if you feel when you wake up in the morning, if you feel like you almost can't drag yourself out of bed to go to work that day because you have no emotional energy to give to your employees or patients or students, whatever it may be, that's a clear sign that something might be off. The second sign is if you have noticed that your attitude is becoming much more cynical, much more of a bad attitude about things that you would normally have a positive attitude about. So declining attitude and perspectives about the people that you work with, including your patients or clients or customers, not just your coworkers. The third symptom of burnout to watch out for is if you start to really feel like you're losing your effectiveness, right? That you're not on your game as much as you typically are. And that decline in your effectiveness can wear on people. It's that feeling of, I'm putting a lot of effort and a lot of work into what I do, and it feels like it's not paying off. I just don't feel very effective anymore. So those are the three common signs that we watch out for.
And you're working in particularly in the medical community where burnout, sadly, is I'll say epidemic. I don't know. I hope it's not, but it's everywhere. And physicians and healthcare workers are the ones that bear the brunt of it. And a part of that is that you go into medicine and you really put in the hours and the hard work. So what's happening with the burnout? Is it overload? Is it too much stress? What's going on?
It could be many things. In healthcare, it is a combination of overwork. So too many demands and pressures on people's resources, meaning their time, their energy levels, their motivation to work. But burnout can be caused by a number of other things, not just the workload. It also comes down to whether employees feel that there's a level of fairness in an organization. And that includes things like, do they feel like they're fairly compensated for the amount and the effort of work that they're putting in? But it also includes things like community. If there's a lack of positive community in a culture, and so that's like where we would look at cultural dynamics. But the the people who are more burned out tend to complain or tend to cite examples of things going on relationally between them and other coworkers. So there are a number of other things that we look out to when we diagnose, and what leaders can do to diagnose really what's driving burnout. It's not just workload.
Right. Now, the beauty of your book is that, yes, it's burnout, but there's the second word in the title is burnout immunity. So, and your focus is helping people avoid it. So, and you have, I love this thing. What's the number one thing that a manager or leader can do to help prevent burnout, either for self or the team? So.
Yeah, the number one thing a leader can do to prevent burnout from themselves is, well, besides read the book, and you'll have tons of resources and tools and strategies at your fingertips to protect yourself from burnout. As a leader, that's job number one, because if you want to be a resilient role model for your employees and your coworkers and your boss, and to be able to contribute to an engaging culture, you need to first work on your own burnout immunity. So that's job number one. Working as a leader, helping your employees achieve burnout immunity, you can do a number of things, but it starts with identifying what's going on in your team, or maybe even the broader organization, that's driving burnout, because you need to diagnose it before you can treat it. So that's where the examples I was talking about, sometimes burnout is driven by workload, sometimes it's level of fairness, sometimes it's breakdown in community, sometimes it's rewards and recognition. So until a leader can really diagnose what's driving levels of burnout in their team, it's harder to recommend specifically what they should be doing. But we want leaders to serve as resilient role models for others, and that begins with working on themselves first.
One of the themes, of course, in leadership today, and this heightened during the pandemic, was vulnerability. Leaders who were admitting they're not perfect. So, what have you seen? Because you've done extensive research, and what happens to an organization when the leader says, "Hey, I've got burnout," or "I'm suffering from it"? What does that give others, the direct reports, permission to acknowledge their own challenges, or what have you seen, Kandi?
Yeah, if you're saying if a leader expresses to either his or her employee or their employees, or if they're saying to their leader, expressing that they are burned out. So I am a huge advocate of opening up the conversation about stress and burnout and really normalizing it and destigmatizing it, especially in industries like healthcare, where mental health has not, in some institutions, it's becoming more destigmatized, but there still is quite a bit of stigma. And in fact, I published an article with some colleagues a couple of years ago looking at this. And so as a leader, I really encourage people and advocate for people to have open conversations, to be comfortable expressing a little bit more vulnerability, because not only will that perhaps help you, because other people may want to help you if you express that what you're going through and what you're experiencing. But the second thing is that it sends a signal, a very strong message to your employees, that it's okay to talk about these things, and you're not the only ones who are feeling the strain and the pressure of this job. I am too. So let's work together as a team and support each other.
Now, if someone is suffering from burnout, be it a leader or an employee, is there a first thing to do?
First thing to do is, well, I have a whole chapter in the book called what I call the 3RX prescription. It's 3 R's. The first R is recover, the second is reconnect, and the third is reimagine. So let's say, for example, you feel burned out once every couple of months. That's actually many of us feel a little bit of burnout every once in a while, maybe once or twice a year. If it's a low level of burnout, that may be resolved by more micro breaks in your day and looking at what's going on. But if it's someone who's experiencing a high degree of burnout, and quite frequently, maybe a couple of times a week even feeling burned out, that requires a lot more recovery. And so they may need to not just take micro breaks, they may need to take a sabbatical or even a shorter vacation, one of the quotes I'll never forget from a research participant who was an emergency medicine physician, very burned out during the summer of 2020, at the height of COVID. She told me that during her healing process, that it wasn't until she got out of that environment to where she could start to heal. So if you think about it that way, that we can't really begin to heal in the place that's making us sick. So if the workplace is making us psychologically unwell, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to heal and recover in that environment. So then the second thing is, as people are recovering from that, because it is a psychological injury, that's really what burnout is after recovering from it, we need ways to reconnect to our values, to people, and to people, places, experiences, and things that we love to do. And that's executive coaching is a great way to help our clients with that, reconnecting to what's most important to them. And then the third step, which coaches help with as well, is helping people who are burned out reimagine their relationship with work. Most people who experience burnout don't want to necessarily quit work forever. Some of them decide to take a different career path or move to a different company, but many of them want to go back into the workplace. And so there's a reimagining phase where people need to really think about their ideal self and their ideal relationship with work. So recover, reconnect, and reimagine.
Those three steps are powerful, and you've expressed them eloquently, but it's hard work.
Mm-hmm.
And I can think, because the people who my perception of suffering, or certainly from the medical community, but other fields, whatever it is, these are highly successful, hard charging, perhaps type A people, but people who are achievers. So telling them to step back is really hard. What is your experience? How do you break through the resistance to that, Kandi?
Well, guilty. I was that person. So I was that person. That's why I got burned out in 2011. I had a hypertensive emergency because I was exposed to so much extreme stress and for a long period of time. I don't know what we tell those people. They have to learn the lesson themselves. In my case, it was a life-threatening wake-up call that really shut the door on me. And but what's interesting is that a lot of times we think about people who are not type A might be more vulnerable to burnout, but actually there's a lot of good research that shows that people who have a high degree of grit, right? They persevere through challenges and they will push through anything. And those are your type A's, that they just keep working, and that, they are problem solvers and they want to work through challenges and stressors. That's a good thing, but without self-awareness, which, as we know, is a key emotional intelligence competency, without the self-awareness to recognize that when they're putting in or exerting more effort and energy than they're giving their body and their psyche time to recover from, it's just eventual that they will potentially get, maybe not burned out, but on the path to burnout, that, they will be at higher risk of burnout.
Well, if I can use you as an example, because you said 2011, which was more than a decade ago. And since that time, well, first of all, you've written a book, plus you've gotten your doctorate and all this other stuff. So how did you reimagine work? Because you didn't quit. What was your reimagining process, Kandi?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question, because recovering from burnout takes time. Everybody's path is going to be a bit different. So mine, when I got burned out, I was a management consultant at the time. I loved my job, and I was one of those very gritty people, type A. But when I had that life-threatening wake-up call and my doctor ordered me to bed rest for 5 days, I spent those 5 days really thinking about what I needed to do next. And so that put me on a path to wanting to discover for myself some answers to the ways that I was coping with stress. So it was really focused on myself at first. And then I got so interested and curious in it that I moved from reading self-help books to reading literature, reading actual studies. And then at one point I just said, you know what, I want to study this myself. I want to go after it and really understand not just what causes burnout, but what is it about these people who work in really high stress jobs, chronic stress for a long period of time, levels of stress that are severe, very severe, worst possible, but they're not burned out. What's going on with them? So that's what I wanted to eventually research. So it was started with self-discovery, but ultimately led to this like intellectual curiosity. And then once my first study was done, I thought, you know what, I am on to something, and I need to not, I wasn't even thinking about the book at that point. It was more, I need to continue to do this research and share it. So I did in the form of workshops. I teach this stuff a lot. And then it's been so useful in the workshops that I do and in the coaching that I do that I thought, you know what, we've got to get this out in the form of a book.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful story. Thank you for your candor. Now, along the way, though, did you limit yourself in the sense that, hey, I've got to take a break. I've got to do my micro breaks or get rest and exercise. What do you advise in that regard, Kandi? So
yeah, for me, and you'll see in the book that there are a number of ways that you can diagnose what's going on with you. A big thing for me was understanding my triggers. So I had to really, really examine what was triggering my stress and why, what was underneath those triggers, what were the past experiences. So that took a lot of work. And it wasn't just me. I was working on that with a coach and with a number of friends and mentors who I was getting advice from. But it doesn't happen overnight. It is work that we have to put in.
right. Now, a key theme in your book, and it's in the subtitle, is emotional intelligence. So we know about IQ per se, but emotional intelligence enables us to get along in the world. If we're suffering from burnout, does something get turned off? Do we lose our self-awareness? What's your perspective, Kandi? So.
It's a good question. Do we lose our self-awareness? Some people may, like in my case, I was less aware of what stress was doing to me because I was more focused on the results that I needed to get and wanted to get. And so that was certainly a key thing that I needed to work on. For other people, this is interesting. One of the things I found in a couple of my studies is that there were a number of people who were very aware that they were burned out, but they weren't doing anything differently. So one of the mindsets I think that's really important for people to have when it comes to burnout immunity is an aware and care mindset, not just being aware that you're stressed, overwhelmed, potentially burned out, but caring for and about yourself enough to actually do something with it, to put that into action. And that was my case. Like I had to make some huge changes in my life. And so, yeah, it really, self-awareness is critical to burnout immunity.
What I discovered, and certainly in working with people who are high achievers, leaders, those who lead organizations, they're outward directed, very good at the needs of the organization, meeting them, what they suffer in. And I think this is maybe true of all high achievers. In some ways, they ignore the self. So how do I focus on the self without perceiving myself as being selfish? So
yeah. There's a thing called sacrifice syndrome, coined by Daniel Goleman, Annie McKee, Richard Boyatzis. They write a lot about sacrifice syndrome and in Resonant Leadership. I love that book. But that it is a very common thing that many leaders go through, especially leaders who have a servant leader mindset. Those leaders who believe that their work adds pro-social value to other people, and they are very committed to the work that they do. And so they oftentimes make choices to put work and other people above their own self-care needs. I've interviewed a number of people who do struggle with that. And so they know what that then means is that if they're aware of that, they then need to regulate. So that regulation is also a key emotional intelligence skill. So if you have an awareness of how your behaviors are not working for you, that you're continually saying yes to things and putting other people ahead of you, or that you're not practicing the right kind of self-care for yourself, which might be different than your neighbor or coworker. It's then taking that awareness and doing something with it. That means changing your behaviors, changing your habits, and that takes effort.
now, as I'm just thinking, as you were talking about that, is there especially for high achievers, when does good become good enough instead of pushing to that nth degree where we snap? So is that a learned behavior, Kandi? So,
That's a great question. I'm taking that to mean, at what point, if you're a high achiever, at what point do you recognize, like, oh, I'm getting close to my snapping point where it's just going to be really unsustainable? I write a lot about something called the sweet spot of stress. And this was coined by another researcher at Stanford named Kelly McGonigal. So the sweet spot of stress, if you think about it, we all need some kind of stress, what's called good stress or eustress.
yeah, stress.
Okay, eustress will help us feel motivated and challenged and engaged. And that then, the more eustress we get, typically the more better we perform, and the more and better we're able to learn and adapt to new things. And that's really our growth zone. But it's like a bell curve if you think about it. So on one end of the spectrum, if we're getting too little stress, our performance and productivity and all that is low, but it goes up the more stress we get. But then at some point it peaks and then starts to come down. So that sweet spot of stress is really understanding and really being aware internally what your signs and signals are that you're getting over that tipping point. For me, I now can recognize when my blood pressure is rising. I also notice, like, I get more irritable, or I feel less creative. I don't feel like writing, so everybody's different, but it's really recognizing what your specific signals and signs are that you're going over your tipping point, and then making a commitment to yourself, being intentional and saying, when I notice these signs coming up, that's when I know I need to back off and I need to then practice some recovery.
I'm glad, interested in the point you talked about. We talk about eustress, the positive stress.
Mhm.
For creative people, that's our juice. That pushes us. But you were saying that sustaining that makes us actually less creative. So is it that I guess we're burned out, but we're exhausted? Is that
Mhm.
what happens to us? So,
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, for creative types, I've interviewed a graphic designer, and she shared a story with me about how she was working 80, 85 hours a week on this huge project, very high visibility project. And she was telling me the story about how she and her coworkers were getting so much pressure because they were on these tight deadlines. And she said it was so counterproductive because the more pressure they were under, the less creative they all felt. And so it backfired. What their leaders intended to happen, which was get the project done on time, actually backfired because the quality and the results and the creativity was not at its best.
that's great. So part of that is you are in the field of medical education. So, Dr. Wiens, can we teach coping mechanisms? How do we do that? So,
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we are learning coping mechanisms whether we're aware of it or not, and we have been ever since we were little. The way that we were raised, our caregivers, and that we were surrounded by, our teachers and coaches, and growing up, and then our early life experiences, early career experiences, we're all exposed to other people who either cope well with stress or don't cope well with stress. And so we're learning from their behaviors. So very informally, of course, it's absolutely a learned behavior. But yes, I mean, the workshops that I run are geared towards that. And a number of other people do this too, where we really focus on helping people develop the right coping strategies. And it might start, for example, with helping people really get clear on and understand what their sweet spot of stress is and what their signs and signals are that they're tipping out of it. And then looking at what are their protective patterns. That's a big one, really helping other people understand what their routines are, their habits, protective patterns that they fall back on. And those protective patterns, whether it's internalizing the stress or externalizing it, or approaching or avoiding it, that may have worked in a different context, in a different lifetime or a different career. But if it's not working for them now, they have to develop new approaches to the way they're dealing with their stress.
now I want to invert your story a bit because I'm guessing you came across it when you talked about the warning signs and stress in the workplace and losing effectiveness. Did you come across any examples where employees themselves confronted their boss or had a conversation with the boss about the boss's stress levels? Did you pick up anything and any suggestions you may have from that kind of challenge? So.
This is interesting. So I don't remember it coming up in my research, but anecdotally, I've run a number of workshops where someone will come up to me during a break or at the end of the workshop and they'll say, this is really great. Like I'm learning a lot. I can see how this is really useful, but it's really my boss that's the problem. My boss is the one who needs this class. And my boss is the one who needs to work on their burnout immunity. So yeah, it's really frustrating for employees who want to work in a good environment, a good culture, but yet if they have a dysfunctional boss or a leader who has, is characteristically dysfunctional behaviors, that's actually one of the number one drivers of burnout is a leader, the way a leader leads their team.
Right. Wonderful. Well, Kandi, we are racing along in this program, and I could keep going and going and going, but time is limited, especially for you, because you've got this big book of burnout immunity to launch. And as you know, I ask every guest a story about grace. Is there one that you can share with us, Kandi?
My story of grace is about giving grace to myself. When I had my life-threatening experience with burnout in 2011, it scared me. It scared my family. And I blamed myself for a long time. And it took me a while to get over that blame and to recognize that yes, there were things that I needed to work on and do differently. And I needed to make some changes to have a healthier relationship with work. But it was really the it was really the work environment and the demands that was causing the stress. So I had to turn that, not change the blame, but really just release the blame and give myself grace and permission to recognize that it wasn't caused by me. It's not me, it's my job that's burning me out.
Thank you for that story. It's very heartwarming because, and again, it gets back to us as leaders, and you certainly are in your field, is that we are conditioned to the needs of others. Servant leadership teaches us that, but guess who gets overlooked? So the positive story of grace is that, yes, it's giving, but it's given to us. So let's use it. So thank you for that wonderful story that really, I think it underlines a core message in your book, Burnout Immunity, of, give yourself a break. As you talked about micro breaks, sabbaticals, whatever works for you. Acknowledge your own limitations. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with that.
Great. Well, Kandi, it's been delightful talking to you. How can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is spelled Kandi with a K and an I, Kandi. Last name is Wiens, Wiens. I have my own website, kandiwiens.com. I have a number of free resources there. You'll see all my Harvard Business Review articles. Those are all free. I will begin writing for Psychology Today in a couple of weeks. I had a Fast Company article come out last week. And anyway, a number of free resources there if you don't have access to the book. But yes, please reach out on LinkedIn or through my website.
Oh, great. And Kandi, it has been such a pleasure to speak to you about your new book, Burnout Immunity. And again, I'll repeat, if ever there was a book for our times, that's it. So you hit the sweet spot of success right there. I'll say that. Anyway, and with that, we will go out.
Thank you, John.